This is assignment number 2 for BFIN 317 Financial Modeling, and today I will be forecasting the sales revenue, income statement, and balance sheet for Advanced Micro Devices, or more commonly known as AMD. So a little bit of a background of the company. AMD is a prominent company in the tech industry. The company was founded in 1969. It began supplying Intel and IBM with processors in 1982, but later found itself in a legal battle with Intel, which ended their partnership. AMD released the first 1 GHz processor onto the market in 2000. The business was expanded in 2003 when it began providing services related to data servers. In 2014, AMD segmented itself into two categories, one to support users of personal computers and one aimed at providing services for business systems. And in 2021 and 2022, AMD purchased two companies, further expanding its business into embedded systems and data centers. So for this forecast, there's going to be two assumptions. One, AMD will continue to grow considerably into the future given the nature of the industry that it operates. Society continues to heavily rely on technology and its advancements, and for this reason, AMD should continue to see growth. Second, AMD will not be purchasing companies for the next 3 years. AMD has acquired 9 companies since its founding, and 2 of them were in the last 2 years. Looking at the sales revenue over the last 10 years, the first thing that stands out is AMD's large growth. Half of the previous 10 years show over 20% in growth. Because of this, I felt fairly confident with the projections for 2023 to 2025 also being over 20%. One thing that I would like to note here, since this will show up later, is that the main driver for sales in 2021 and 2022 was in its embedded and data center segments. So here's the information from the previous slide presented in a graph. For this forecast, I went with a polynomial function. Because AMD's sales growth was as large as it was in the previous period, a linear regression was not possible. I think that this is a fairly decent projection given the function, but it may even be on the conservative side given the immense growth seen during 2020 and 2022. Moving to the income statement, we see that the value shown in the sales revenue graph depicting total revenue. Cost of revenue for all 3 years is between 50 and 55%, and in turn gross profit margin for those years averaging at 45%. R&D is going to be an important row to keep in mind because AMD does a large amount of research given the nature of their business and to stay competitive in the market. This expense has been increasing over the years and is likely to continue this way into the future. Similarly, sales, general, and administration have also been increasing. Other operating items are going to be important for this forecast, and 2022 is going to carry a lot of weight when looking at the next 3 years. This is due to the acquisition that was made that will be analyzed further in detail on the balance sheet. Other than 2022, operating income has been increasing, also due to the acquisition. Due to the assumption that AMD will not be acquiring any other companies in the next 3 years, operating income will continue to increase year over year in 2023 to 2025. For additional income expense items, AMD lost money on investments in 2020 and 2022, but gained a return on investment in 2021. There was much volatility in the market during this period because of the pandemic, so for the projection, I took the average between the two positive years, 21 and 22, which was 0.15%. EBT was also increasing, minus 2022, again due to the acquisition. After all is accounted for, the net incomes are 2.5 billion, 3.2 billion, and 1.3 billion. Moving to the projection for the income statement, the sales revenue forecast is carried over into years 2023, 2024, and 2025. I kept the cost of revenue at 54%, leaving the remaining 46% for gross profit. For R&D, I took the 21.21% figure from 2022 because it was not only the most recent figure, but also the highest. Because of AMD's business model, it wouldn't be surprising if this is even slightly higher than 21% for the following years. Sales, general, and admin were held constant at the 2022%. For other operating items, I took them back to zero. Again, using my assumption, the purchase of 2.1 billion was a one-time purchase that won't be repeated in the coming years. The remaining items, other than additional income and expense items and income tax, were simply the average from the years before. For additional income expense, I took the average of years 2021 and 2022. This was because it is difficult to tell how their equity investments will do in the future, but AMD also had a large interest income of $65 million in 2022, which offset the large portion of its losses. For income tax, I took the positive tax rate AMD paid in 2021, given it's the only year here in which taxes were paid, and that was at 14%. These choices give AMD a final forecast for net income to be 3.6 billion in 2023, 4.6 billion in 2024, and 5.6 billion in 2025, all of which will be added to the balance sheet for retained earnings. Moving to the balance sheet, we will first look at the historical assets. As I touch on each line item, I will share the assumption associated with that, as it will provide a better understanding of the projected numbers. As noted earlier, AMD did acquire companies in 2021 and 2022, and there's going to be large increases in those years on the balance sheet. Moving to the first line item, we'll see cash and cash equivalents, and there's an upward trend that carries across the 4 years. This stays true for accounting's receivable, inventories, and prepaid expenses in current assets. Short-term investments between 21 and 22 leveled out, and this was due to volatility in the market, as noted in AMD's 10K. With the pandemic behind us, I assume to see this number start to increase again as stability returns to the markets. Receivables from related parties decreased. There's little information here, so for the projection, this number will remain constant. Moving to long-term assets, again, everything expanded over the 4-year period, with most of it occurring in the 2 years of AMD's expansion, except for deferred tax assets. As tax credit was used in 2021, outlined in the 10K, this likely caused a decrease. The most important line to pay attention to here are goodwill and acquisition-related intangibles. Again, these are due to the expansion, and these figures will remain constant in the projection. Bringing us to the total assets, this has been increasing over the years at a very rapid rate, which I would expect to still increase, but at a slower rate in the future. Now going to current liabilities, all these line items have also been increasing apart from the current portion of long-term debt, similar to how the assets have been increasing. The current portion of long-term debt was at 0 for every year except 21. There's no detail given, but it is likely that some debt obligation reached maturity and was paid. For this reason, the projection will hold the current portion of long-term debt at 0. The long-term liabilities section is going to be a little more inconsistent. Looking at long-term debt, it looks like AMD was paying down most of it, getting to $1 million. In 2022, after the acquisition, it increased dramatically to 2.5 billion. Because AMD was paying down their debt prior to this point, this number will be reducing again in the projection. Similarly, deferred tax liability was near 0 from 2019 to 2021, and in 2022 increased again to almost $2 billion. Because AMD has been paying down its obligations in the past, I again expect to see this number decrease going into the future. I'm going to be making the same assumption for other long-term liabilities as well. It is important to note, however, that liabilities have been increasing at a slower rate than the equity, and this trend will continue into the projection despite holding all equity line items minus retained earnings constant. Because net income increased considerably in the projected years, the accumulated deficit will become retained earnings, increasing the shareholder equity in the future. Finally, we will be looking at the projected balance sheet, starting with the asset side. Every item in current assets, apart from inventories and receivables, use the percents from the common sized. Most of the figures use the percent from 2022 rather than the average because AMD has showed no signs of slowing down their performance, and this would be the most relevant prediction for the next 3 years. Going back to inventories, AMD has been dramatically increasing their raw materials, work in process, and finished goods. Noted in the 10K, AMD is planning on ramping up production in the coming years. For this reason, rather than going with the average inventory percent of 16, I decided to increase it to 17% for the projection. Receivables from related parties were held constant. Moving to the long-term assets, again, most items are going to be increasing by its common size percent from 2022, minus the goodwill, acquisition-related intangibles, and deferred tax assets. Goodwill and acquisition-related intangibles are held constant due to my acquisition assumption. I left the deferred tax asset as a constant because it held a downward trend from 2020 to 2022, but it is difficult to determine when and by how much it will be used. This brings the asset side of the balance sheet to 72.5 billion, 78.7 billion, and 86.1 billion in 2023, 2024, and 2025. Moving on to the final slide, it's time to address the liabilities and shareholders' equity half of the balance sheet. For the first three line items and other current liabilities, I use the percent from the most recent year of 2022. These items have been increasing over the years, so I carried this growth rate over into the projected year. As for the current portion of long-term debt, 2021 was an outlier, being the only year to show a figure. Because of this, I left the current portion of long-term debt at zero. Now to the long-term liabilities, the first line item was calculated slightly differently. Historically, this number decreased until 2022, after the acquisition. I used the percent from 2019, which was 7%, as my starting point, and continued the trend of decreasing it throughout the projected years. The next line item was simply the common-sized average. Deferred tax liability was another line item that was an outlier. There had been no tax liability until 2021, and in 2022 this category saw a 16,000% increase. Because this is odd of AMD, I decided that it would likely pay back this tax liability over the next upcoming years, like it had been doing with all of its other liabilities up to this point. The final line item, other long-term liabilities, was calculated using the average percent from the common sized because of its increasing trend in the past. The last section of the liabilities slide is shareholders' equity. All line items here were held constant apart from accumulated deficit, which becomes retained earnings in 2023. Retained earnings were calculated from all the assumptions from the income statement that resulted in the net income for the future 3 years. The retained earnings came from that net income added to the previous year's retained earnings, or in the case of 2023, the accumulated deficit in 2022. When everything is put together, the total liabilities and shareholders' equity comes to 72.5 billion, 78.7 billion, and 86.1 billion in the years 2023, 2024, and 2025. These numbers align with those projected on the asset side, balancing out the sheet. This brings us to the end of the forecast, and here are the references.